Announcements none. Papers have been laid. Motion.
Mr. Speaker, sir, I beg to move that all the business on today's order paper be exempted from the provisions of paragraph 2 of Standing Order 10.
The question that all the business on today's order paper be exempted from the provisions of paragraph 2 of Standing Order 10. Those in favour say aye. Those against say no. Aye. The ayes have it.
Statement by Minister.
Mr. Siwatan.
Mr. Speaker, sir, with your permission, I wish to make a statement on the latest developments with regard to the inclusion of Mauritius under the Financial Action Task Force list of jurisdictions under increased monitoring. Mr. Speaker, sir, for recall, in my statement to the House on 24 February 2020, I informed this Assembly about the substantial progress made in relation to technical compliance with respect to the FATF recommendations since the mutual evaluation report in 2018, where Mauritius was rated largely compliant or compliant with 35 out of 40 FATF recommendations. I also informed the House that the FATF had identified 5 strategic deficiencies which Mauritius must implement to improve the level of effectiveness of its AML-CFT regime. At its plenary meeting in February 2020, the FATF placed Mauritius on its list of jurisdictions under increased monitoring and provided Mauritius with an action plan to be implemented within a time frame of around 2 years. At this plenary meeting, Mauritius took a high-level political commitment to implement the action plan within the agreed timelines. Mr. Speaker, sir, since the placing of Mauritius on the FATF list, government has been proactive in tackling these strategic deficiencies, inter alia, through the setting up of an interministerial committee chaired by the Honourable Prime Minister to monitor closely the progress made in the implementation of the action plan. The Honourable Prime Minister has extended his unflinching support to my ministry and all relevant institutions in this national effort to strengthen the country's AML-CFT framework, both in terms of technical compliance and effectiveness. In this context, government has invested massively in all supervisory bodies and law enforcement agencies to provide them with all necessary resources. Mr. Speaker, sir, the core group of the National Committee on Anti-Money Laundering and Combating the Financing of Terrorism, chaired by the Financial Secretary, has been overseeing the work being undertaken by all the implementing agencies and provided strategic guidance as appropriate. In December 2020, a subcommittee of the core group was mandated to ensure close monitoring of the remaining action plan items. The subcommittee met the relevant implementing agencies almost on a daily basis to ensure that any challenges are dealt with promptly and the agencies focus their activities in demonstrating progress made in addressing the FATF action plan. Mr. Speaker, sir, a first progress report was submitted in March 2020, but could not be considered by the FATF in view of the prevailing COVID-19 situation. Subsequently, on 31st July 2020, Mauritius submitted a revised first progress report to the FATF, Africa Middle East Joint Group. A second progress report was submitted to the Joint Group on 27th November 2020 to demonstrate further progress made in addressing the 5 strategic deficiencies identified by FATF since July 2020. Mauritius submitted a third progress report to the Joint Group on 2nd April 2021, which was considered at the recent June 2021 FATF plenary. It is to be noted that during all virtual face-to-face meetings held with the Joint Group and the FATF plenaries held since September 2020, Mauritius has been commended for its strong political commitment and the sustained progress made in the implementation of the FATF action plan. Mr. Speaker, sir, at this plenary meeting held from 23rd to 25th June 2021, FATF has made the initial determination that Mauritius has substantially completed its action plan and warrants an on-site assessment to verify that the implementation of Mauritius AML-CFT reforms has begun and is being sustained, and that the necessary political commitment remains in place to sustain implementation in the future. FATF has highlighted that Mauritius has made the following key reforms, including by first conducting outreach to promote understanding of ML and TF risk and obligations, 2, developing risk-based supervision plans effectively for the Financial Services Commission, 3, ensuring access to accurate basic and beneficial ownership information by competent authorities in a timely manner, and 4, providing training for law enforcement authorities to ensure that they have the capability to conduct money laundering investigations. FATF will continue to monitor the COVID-19 situation and conduct an on-site visit at the earliest possible date. Mr. Speaker, sir, it is worth noting that during the ICRG process, Mauritius has worked in close collaboration with the SAMLAG Secretariat, which provided technical support and valuable guidance to the Mauritian authorities. Mauritius has also benefited from technical assistance from the European Union, Germany, UK, France, the IMF, and the UNODC to support the implementation of the action plan. For the period July 2020 to date, around 1,000 participants from different implementing and supervisory bodies have received training in numerous fields, including inter alia, suspicious transactions reporting, risk-based supervision, beneficial ownership, parallel financial investigations, targeted financial sections, risk assessment of non-profit organizations, and terrorism financing. As far as possible, trainings were conducted online, and all physical trainings were conducted in accordance with strict sanitary protocols. Mr. Speaker, sir, the positive outcome from the FATF is a result of work undertaken by all the supervisors, law enforcement agencies, and different committees who have worked diligently and tirelessly. This is also the result of the public-private partnership in this national effort. It is worth noting that since the placing of Mauritius on the FATF list of jurisdictions under increased monitoring, the different institutions and the private sector have displayed an unprecedented spirit of teamwork and very strong collaboration with a common objective to exit the FATF list at the earliest. In fact, Mr. Speaker, sir, over the past few years, government has intensified its efforts and deployed a series of remarkable measures to bring our jurisdiction in conformity with international norms. Mauritius made further progress in respect of technical compliance and is now rated compliant or largely compliant with 36 out of 40 FATF recommendations. This demonstrates our unflinching commitment to continue strengthening our AML-CFT system well before and beyond the FATF list, thereby ensuring effective adherence to all international standards on AML-CFT. Mr. Speaker, sir, to conclude, I would like to mention that my ministry, together with a core group on AML-CFT and concerned institutions, have already developed an extensive work plan in preparation for the submission of the next progress report to the Africa Middle East Joint Group and the forthcoming on-site visit of the FATF delegation. Let me reassure the House that the government will continue along this path and will remain committed to leave no stone unturned to complete the delisting process in the FATF list of jurisdictions under increased monitoring. This will enable Mauritius to eventually exit the EU and UK list of high-risk third countries. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, sir.
Public bill, third reading.
Mr. Speaker, sir, I move that the appropriation 2021-2022 bill 2021 number 10 of 2021 be read a third time and passed.
Seconded. The question is the appropriation 2021-2022 bill 2021 number 10 of 2021 be read the third time and passed. Those in favor say aye. Those against say no. The ayes have it.
Public bill, second reading.
Minister Padeachi.
Mr. Speaker, sir, I move that the supplementary appropriation 2020-2021 number 2 bill number 11 of 2021 be read a second time. The bill makes provision for a supplementary appropriation of 23 billion and 600 million rupees under Vote 27.1 centrally managed initiatives of government in respect of services of government for the financial year 2020-2021. The House will recall that a sum of 144.3 billion rupees was voted for financial year 2020-2021. In addition, a supplementary appropriation bill of 17 billion rupees was introduced in the National Assembly in November 2020 and was voted in May 2021, mainly for equity injection in the National Property Fund Limited to enable the company to meet its immediate debt obligations. Mr. Speaker, sir, between November 2020 and now, there have been major unforeseen developments at the national level. In particular, there has been the second lockdown in March-April 2021 with the resurgence of the virus. Accordingly, government took a number of measures to preserve livelihoods and mitigate the negative impact on the economy. The wage assistance scheme and the self-employed assistance scheme was extended to workers in the non-tourism sector. A one-off grant of 10,000 rupees was also paid to the self-employed. In addition, new projects and schemes were approved under the Economic Recovery Program. Furthermore, expenditure has to be incurred following the decision of the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in the case of Betamax Limited versus State Trading Corporation. Mr. Speaker, sir, it is in this context that the House is being called to vote for a second supplementary appropriation bill, which is in line with Section 105(3)(a) of the Constitution. The supplementary appropriation of 23.6 billion rupees caters for the following. First, a grant of 9.2 billion rupees to the National Resilience Fund, mainly in connection with the payment of a one-off grant to self-employed and the payment of the wage assistance scheme and the self-employed assistance scheme. Second, a grant of 4 billion rupees to the COVID-19 Project Development Fund for the implementation of additional projects approved under the Economic Recovery Program. Third, a grant of 4.6 billion rupees to the State Trading Corporation to enable the corporation to settle its liability following the decision of the Privy Council in the Betamax versus STC case. Fourth, a contribution of 2.5 billion rupees towards the National Environment and Climate Change Fund for implementation of projects and programs aimed at protecting the environment and mitigating risk associated with climate change. Fifth, an initial contribution of 1 billion rupees towards the National COVID-19 Vaccination Program Fund for the purchase of vaccines. And sixth, 2.3 billion rupees to write off some long outstanding loans that were provided to public bodies. The items of expenditure concerned, as well as explanatory notes thereon, are set out in the estimates of supplementary expenditure that has already been tabled in the National Assembly. Mr. Speaker, sir, I will now elaborate on each of the items requiring supplementary appropriation. In the 2020-2021 budget, provision was made for payment of the wage assistance scheme and the self-employed assistance scheme to those working in the tourism sector only as a second wave of the COVID-19 epidemic in Mauritius was not anticipated. With the resurgence of the virus in March 2021, as a policy decision, all expenses in connection with securing livelihoods and supporting employment and enterprises that were not budgeted are being met under the NRF. Accordingly, an amount of 9.2 billion rupees is required under the National Resilience Fund for the following: 2.3 billion rupees for the one-off grant of 10,000 rupees paid to some 227,000 self-employed in March 2021, and 6.9 billion rupees for payment of wage assistance scheme and self-employed assistance scheme. This provision will entirely cater for payment for half the month of March of wage assistance scheme and self-employed assistance scheme to operators in the non-tourism sector, payment for a full month of April of wage assistance scheme and self-employed assistance scheme to SMEs and self-employed, large public bus companies and large enterprises which were not allowed to operate, such as casinos, payment for the full month of May and June of wage assistance scheme to enterprises which had to remain closed following the lifting of the national confinements, such as registered training institutions, restaurants and fast food, fitness centers, casinos, cinemas, and wedding halls, or those whose activities are located in a red zone. Self-employed assistance scheme were also paid to self-employed who were not allowed to operate, such as artists, hawkers, who reside in a red zone or whose activities are located in a red zone, and payment of wage assistance scheme and self-employed assistance scheme up to September 2021, that is aligned with government decision for partial reopening of borders on 15th July and full reopening as from 1st October 2021. The grant of 2.5 billion to the National Environment and Climate Change Fund will be used as follows: 0.8 billion rupees for cleaning and embellishment of public sites, drains, bridges, and rivers, including for the acquisition of compactor, tipper lorries, and other equipment. 0.6 billion rupees for the rehabilitation, protection, and management of beaches, lagoons, and coral reefs. 0.6 billion rupees for the solid waste management program, including vertical expansion project at Marshy Coast landfill, and 0.5 billion rupees for the landslide management program. The supplementary appropriation of 4 billion to the COVID-19 Project Development Fund will be used for the implementation of projects that were approved under the Economic Recovery Program. This provision will be utilized as follows: 2.1 billion rupees for infrastructure projects such as construction of roads, sports and leisure amenities, as well as projects in Rodrigues and Agaliga. 0.65 billion rupees for the solar water heater schemes, installation of solar PV on public buildings. 0.25 billion rupees for environment protection and embellishment, and 0.3 billion rupees for the acquisition of modern tools for local authorities, replacement of irrigation system, acquisition of water tankers, installation of inflatable reservoirs, and replacement of defective production meters. As regards the STC, on 22nd June 2021, the corporation has paid around 5.6 billion rupees to Betamax Limited, representing damages for default under the contract of affreightment and legal and associated costs. In this context, government provided an advance of 4.6 billion rupees from the consolidated fund to the corporation. The remaining balance of around 1 billion rupees was met by the corporation from its own funds. Accordingly, a provision of 4.6 billion rupees is required to clear the advance. Concerning the National COVID-19 Vaccination Program Fund, 1 billion rupees is being provided to meet the cost of acquiring vaccines. As at date, 862,400 doses of vaccine has been purchased, and a sum of 609 million rupees has been spent. Moreover, orders have been placed for the purchase of some 3.3 million doses of vaccines, for which funds will be required. This supplementary appropriation will therefore cater for the amount already spent and also ensure availability of sufficient funds for effecting timely payments in respect of upcoming deliveries of vaccines. Mr. Speaker, sir, in this supplementary appropriation bill, we are also providing for the write-off of some long outstanding loans which were extended to some public bodies by successive governments from the Consolidated Fund. Some of them date back to more than 3 decades and have still not yet been repaid. I wish to inform the House that several actions have been initiated by government to ensure the recovery of these loans. This action includes entirely the following: rigorous monitoring of repayment of the loans as scheduled by sending timely repayment notices, rescheduling of repayment of loans in cases where the public bodies are facing cash flow and financial difficulties, and providing a longer moratorium period for the loans so that the public bodies can service the loans when they have started to reap positive returns on their investments. In spite of the above measures, some of these public bodies are still not in a position to repay their loans to government in view of their precarious financial situation, which has exacerbated with the outbreak of the pandemic. The House will note that this issue has been raised by the Director of Audit in his reports. In addition, in my reply to a parliamentary question on the subject matter last month, I informed the House that my ministry was analyzing on a case-to-case basis the financial situation of these public bodies and that I will come up with appropriate measures. It is in this context that we are writing off in a phased manner some of the outstanding loans for public bodies that have no repayment capacity. My ministry will continue to work with public bodies in implementing turnaround plans to improve their financial situation, including measures to contain expenditure and reduce wastage, raise revenue, and better manage their assets. A sum of 2.3 billion rupees is therefore being appropriated to write off outstanding loans as follows: 732.8 million rupees for Central Water Authority, 651.2 million rupees for Polytechnic Mauritius Limited, 385.1 million rupees for Wastewater Management Authority, 291.2 million rupees for Irrigation Authority, 154.1 million rupees for National Transport Corporation, 67.3 million rupees for Mauritius Broadcasting Corporation, 5.7 million rupees for Mauritius Meat Authority, and 12.7 million rupees for other institutions. Mr. Speaker, sir, the approval of the House is being sought for the writing off of the above outstanding capital amounts, given that funds were initially appropriated and released as loans to these public bodies. The supplementary appropriation of 2.3 billion rupees will be used solely for effecting book adjustment in the accounts of government and will therefore not entail any cash withdrawal from the Consolidated Fund. As regards the arrears on interest and penalties on these loans, they will be waived accordingly. Mr. Speaker, sir, I wish to inform the House that except for the grant to the STC, the above supplementary expenditure has already been factored in the revised estimate for the current financial year that were published in the 2021-2022 budget estimates. The budget deficit for the current financial year is now expected to be around 6.6% of GDP instead of 5.6%. The public sector debt would be around 96% of GDP instead of 95% of GDP. Mr. Speaker, sir, I now commend the bill to the House.
Seconded.
Mr. Speaker, sir, I have a number of points to make. The first point relates to the explanatory memorandum of the bill. Now, this is what it says. The object of this bill is to provide for expenditure, both recurrent and capital, in respect of services of government for the financial year 2020-2021. Now, do you believe that, Mr. Speaker, after what you've heard the Minister say, do you believe that we are on the 29th of June, tomorrow is the end of the financial year, and suddenly the Minister of Finance is going to spend 23.6 billion rupees? Of course, it's a misnomer. In fact, Mr. Speaker, I would even go to say that this explanatory memorandum is a fake. Because, Mr. Speaker, of this 23.6 billion, let me take out the 4.6 billion to Betamax, which I understand it has already been paid, etc., etc. But the bulk of the 23.6 billion rupees consists of 16.7 billion rupees transferred to special funds. Now, these special funds, when will they be used? Because according to the government, to the minister's own estimates, which are year in, year out underestimated, at the end of next financial year, which is going to start in 2 days' time, there will be at least 20 billion rupees standing to the credit, therefore available in those same special funds. What we are saying, Mr. Speaker, is there is sufficient amounts of money already in the special funds to meet all the expenditures that the Honourable Minister had just told us he has met or will meet. All of them. In fact, Mr. Speaker, there is, according to his own estimates, 35 billion rupees in special funds. There will be at the end of business tomorrow and the opening of business on the 1st of July. 35 billion rupees. Even if you were to take out the 17 billion rupees, you still end up, Mr. Speaker, with 18, 19 billion rupees left to spend on anything that the minister, on everything that the minister has told us he has spent. That money is already there. So I reiterate my point, Mr. Speaker, that what government is trying to do is building a war chest for the future, building as much as possible, increasing the budget deficit as much as possible in this year, maybe even next year, so that they can build a war chest to be used and spent on an unsuspecting electorate ahead of the next political electoral campaign, Mr. Speaker. That is what is being done today. In fact, Mr. Speaker, the appropriate explanatory memorandum for this bill today would be is that it's providing supplementary appropriation, both recurrent and capital, in respect of services of government for the financial years 2020-2021, 2021-2022, 2022-2023, at least, and probably even more, right ahead of the next general election. That is what this bill is providing, because there is already tons of money in the special fund sufficient to meet all of the expenditure that have been incurred to date. And as the government minister himself has said, this money will be when? Not tomorrow. Will be when? Next year, year after. So that is, Mr. Speaker, my first point. It is artificially increasing the budget deficit to make future years look better for the government, because the money will be used from that huge kitty. Never before has the special funds reached that sort of amount. And as I mentioned, Mr. Speaker, to keep a war chest for the next electoral campaign, therefore killing two birds with one stone, Mr. Speaker, sir. So there have been uses of special funds, ever since, I think, 2008. But never on this gigantic scale, so much so, Mr. Speaker, that the figures that have been given as far as budget deficit is concerned, as far as public debt is concerned, the figures are today meaningless and do not reflect reality. So much tampering has occurred in respect to public debt, in respect to special funds, in respect to budget deficit, in respect to amounts granted, given, loaned by the Bank of Mauritius, that figures that the government of Mauritius now are giving us as to budget deficit and public debt are, Mr. Speaker, totally meaningless, and that is what the sad thing about it. And I say again, if this bill was not to be passed today, there would still, Mr. Speaker, be about 4 billion rupees left at the end of next year in the special funds. Gives you an idea, Mr. Speaker, that really this amount of money is not required neither for this year, neither for next year. It will be after those 2 years that money may be used. And my second point, Mr. Speaker, is whose money is this anyway that we are putting in the special fund? Whose money is it? Because in the course of this financial year, 31.7 billion rupees, about 32 billion rupees, have been transferred to special funds. Where does this money come from? Does it come from a flourishing economy? Does it come from huge taxes received? Where does it come from? Of course not. Of course it doesn't come from all that. It comes from the Bank of Mauritius. That is where the money comes from. We have to be clear about the source of that money that is being put in special funds. In all, at the end of business tomorrow, there will be about 35 billion rupees, all of it, money from the Bank of Mauritius. We remember, Mr. Speaker, that over the last 2 years, a huge amount of 158 billion rupees has been snatched from the Bank of Mauritius to pay for government's expenditures, often wasted expenditure, and for the MIC, Mauritius Investment Corporation. We were first told, Mr. Speaker, by the then Minister of Finance and by the current Minister of Finance, that the IMF approved this. This was fine, I mean, it's okay. IMF has approved, even the Bank of Mauritius told us it's fine. IMF has approved, that is not true. And when you read, Mr. Speaker, not only the press releases, but the full staff report and the director's comments released this morning, early this morning, you will see, Mr. Speaker, that what has been done is not at all to the taste of the IMF. Because what they have said, 3 things. One is not to proceed with any further such transfers to the government of Mauritius. In fact, change the law to preempt, I'm quoting the IMF, preempt such transfers in the future. It says again, Mr. Speaker, we are told again, secondly, that the MIC should be financed directly from government's own funds and not from the Bank of Mauritius, which should disengage from the MIC. And, Mr. Speaker, this is probably the worst thing. In the IMF's own words, the balance sheet of the Bank of Mauritius has been degraded. Can you imagine that word used in an IMF report? All these transfers from the Bank of Mauritius to the government of Mauritius has degraded the balance sheet of the Bank of Mauritius. It has been, according to the IMF, subject to substantial deterioration of its balance sheet, which could challenge fulfilling the Bank of Mauritius price stability mandate. That is, defending the value of rupee, mopping up excess liquidity, etc. So, Mr. Speaker, we are here putting in a war chest money that doesn't rightly belong to the government of Mauritius. It belongs to the Bank of Mauritius. And here, Mr. Speaker, when the IMF tell us that we should recapitalize the Bank of Mauritius, what does that mean? Recapitalize the Bank of Mauritius. In fact, it means we should return money that we have taken to the Bank of Mauritius. That is what it says. It should return the money that we have taken back to the Bank of Mauritius. And that is, Mr. Speaker, what the IMF is saying. Return it. And instead, and this is my point, instead of returning at least the 16.7 billion rupees that appear available today and which we are putting in special funds, at least that, probably also the 2.3 billion of write-off of all balances, all this money, Mr. Speaker, instead of being put in a special fund, should be returned to the Bank of Mauritius to recapitalize the bank. And I will tell you, Mr. Speaker, why it is urgent that we should recapitalize the Bank of Mauritius, that is, prop up its balance sheet, because it is necessary for us to have a stable Bank of Mauritius to defend the rupee, and we'll talk about that in a moment, to mop up excess liquidity, and to do such other things that the Bank of Mauritius mandate requires the bank to do. Mr. Speaker, if you calculate since the government has been snatching money away from the Bank of Mauritius. The balance sheet of Mauritius, the Bank of Mauritius, has weakened by 41 billion. I don't want to go too much into figures, has deteriorated by 41 billion rupees. In fact, I can prove, any decent accountant can prove, that at yesterday's date, before the devaluation, the Bank of Mauritius, Mr. Speaker, had a deficit on its balance sheet. It had a deficit of about 5 billion rupees on its balance sheet. Not a surplus, a deficit of 5 billion rupees. So much money has been taken by the government, Mr. Speaker. 5 billion rupee deficit on its balance sheet for the once reputed Bank of Mauritius. So the Bank of Mauritius equity is negative, mainly, Mr. Speaker, because of this 28 billion rupee forced loan, not loan, advance, not advance, given to the government of Mauritius. Now, Mr. Speaker, I have taken the trouble to write to the auditors of the Bank of Mauritius. You know who the auditors are, Mr. Speaker? A firm called KPMG. Now, KPMG is renowned in Mauritius, but perhaps not sufficiently renowned. I'm just saying that so that people know. The KPMG, in fact, were the auditors of BAI when BAI went bankrupt. I'm not saying anything funny is going on because the senior partner then was fired. But, so KPMG are now the auditors of the Bank of Mauritius. And I have written to them to tell them to be very careful and not to include supposed assets which are only recoverable over 200 years. So we'll see what KPMG do with my letter and with the audit responsibilities. Because it's not up to me, it's not up to the Minister of Finance or even the governor of the Bank of Mauritius to decide whether the Bank of Mauritius balance sheet is in deficit or not in deficit. It has to be approved by auditors, and that is why KPMG have an extremely important role to play, and I'm just, Mr. Speaker, through this speech, putting them in front of their responsibilities. Now, Mr. Speaker, what's happened, of course, is that by magic, the rupee has been depreciated substantially yesterday, by 4%. I think the rupee now, if you take it against the dollar, the rupee will be something like 43 rupees against the dollar. Since the election, Mr. Speaker, the rupee has lost 16% of its value against the dollar. The rupee has lost 25% of its value since the election of December 2019, 25% against the euro. The rupee has lost another 26% against the pound sterling. What does that mean? That means for the Bank of Mauritius that all its reserves will be obviously revaluated. And the deficit that it was going to show as of the day before yesterday suddenly will disappear through an artificial revaluation of its reserves. An artificial, if you want, fictitious, not realized revaluation of its reserves. And that will, for the unknowing, save the Bank of Mauritius from showing a deficit on its balance sheet after, as I mentioned, the 28 billion rupee correction is made to this advance that is not an advance. So, Mr. Speaker, the devaluation of yesterday, massive devaluation, has a cost. It has a cost for inflation. People who have to buy all sorts of foodstuffs which are imported, people who are constructing houses, people who have the ambition to buy a small car, a new car, everything will go up and has been going up and will continue to increase. Bank of Mauritius balance sheet will be protected. It will show artificially a surplus, but who is going to, there's never a free meal, as they say, Mr. Speaker. Who is going to bear the brunt of that? It is, Mr. Speaker, the consumer. Now, what has been done, Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned, the Bank of Mauritius has been degraded, the balance sheet has been degraded, and money given to the government and now put into this special fund. In fact, Mr. Speaker, if you want to coin perhaps a well-known proverb, déshabiller Saint-Pierre pour habiller Saint-Paul. This is what the government has done. It déshabille the Bank of Mauritius and habille the government's own finances with the consequential effect on the Bank of Mauritius, Mr. Speaker. That is, in a colloquial way, people might understand what has actually happened, what the Minister of Finance has done. He's been good at déshabiller et réhabiller. And this is, Mr. Speaker, what I think the people will understand properly. At the cost, Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned, of a strong devaluation in the rupee, probably unprecedented except in the bad old days, unprecedented with a massive effect on the cost of living and the purchasing power of Mauritians, Mr. Speaker. And of course, further losses on the Bank of Mauritius balance sheet is expected as the investments in the Mauritius Investment Corporation continue to play, Mr. Speaker. And the third thing, before I move on to a few other items, is accountability. Now, in the past, wrongly so, I think, we were always blamed for using special funds and them not being accounted for, and not there's no accountability as to the expenses, Mr. Speaker. In fact, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to show you, to complain about the estimates this year. The estimates this year, do you have it? Try estimates? No. Okay, the estimates this year, Mr. Speaker, give no idea at all about how the funds have been used over the year. We know, Mr. Speaker, that in last year's estimates, here you are, in last year's estimates, we were supposed to have, here it is, Mr. Speaker, we were supposed to have 9.1 billion rupees tomorrow in the special funds. That is what we were given last year. We are given this year, Mr. Speaker, this page here, page 485, with a piece of paper that says that tomorrow there will be 35 billion rupees in the special funds. The difference between one and the other, we can only guess. We can guess that it is 16.7 billion is there, but if you take 9 billion and you add 16 billion, you still don't come to the 35 billion here. We have no idea, Mr. Speaker, about what money has really been received in the special funds, and most importantly, where this money has been spent. We have no idea. It has not been provided for. And now, Mr. Speaker, I'll give you why I think democracy is in fact being undermined and going down the drain hole in Mauritius. This is what used to be provided under the old government. This is what used to be provided. I'm going to give you, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to table that. This is the estimates of 2014. I was Minister of Finance. And you look at it, it's completely different to this one, because it gives you the whole history of each special fund, the amount, the receipts, the payments, the transfers, ever since the fund was set up, so that you could follow at any time and question in Parliament and speak in the budget debates. You could tell exactly what has happened in a special fund. Today, Mr. Speaker, accounting-wise, we don't know exactly what the Minister of Finance has done with the special fund. It is a black hole. We can guess, like a jigsaw puzzle, we can try and put, but we will never get to the figures because we don't have the figures simply. And this is, Mr. Speaker, if you don't mind me saying so, it is a lack of respect to the National Assembly. It is a lack of respect to ask us to vote successively up to 31.7 billion rupees in special funds over the year, and not to tell us exactly, not to account for it in this House, and expect for us to have a debate like this, and expect for us to speak during the budget debates without knowing what has happened to taxpayers' money. It is a lack of respect, Mr. Speaker. Similarly, as we have just been given now by the Minister of Finance, details of the 2.3 billion rupees that is going, the debts that is going to write off. Is it, Mr. Speaker, not a lack of respect to wait for his second speech, the second reading debate speech, to tell us where that 2.3 billion is going? Does he expect us to respond like that, off the cuff, from figures that he has given? Can't we have, Mr. Speaker, with your help, some more respect for the National Assembly, that we are given exactly the movements on the special funds, so that the main purpose of the National Assembly is to control funds spent and received by government? Isn't it more respectful to provide us this figure? And isn't it disrespectful of the Minister of Finance in his second readings debate to give us details of the 2.3 billion rupees of write-off that is going to effect in a few moments, Mr. Speaker? Let it be like that. I hope that, Mr. Speaker, that what I have said hasn't gone on deaf ears. And as it is, we will have to wait for the report of the Director of Audit in February to be able to understand what has actually happened in these special funds. Thank God for the Director of Audit. Mr. Speaker, a few other things before I finish. The wage assistance scheme, which is monies are being provided here for the wage assistance scheme. Now, again, the IMF has mentioned it. I've mentioned it before. It can't just be stopped abruptly on the 30th of September. There will be companies, especially in the tourism sector, but also in the leisure industry. We're talking about cinemas, etc., restaurants, which will continue